Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're gonna cover Unit 5, which will focus on insider threats. We're gonna do a lab with Purple Team's tools. So you are gonna use Greenbone and some of the tools that the industry supports. So we'll start with the lecture notes and the assignments for this week. So one of the area that's really difficult to detect is going to be insider threats, right? Human behavior change. A lot of times this goes undetected. So we want to make sure that we understand the type of behavior and some of the things that we need to look for and what kind of security measures we would have for insider threats and the different types of insider threats that we're going to see. So at the beginning of the notes, it shows you that the insider attacks is a lot more complex and challenging, right? Because these individuals would have authorized access. Sometimes they have been with the companies for a long time. Many of the studies shown that people actually leverage the company's knowledge and also skill sets that they acquire at the company to be able to leverage their new job. So in the case of fraudulent, we want to be able to detect it a little bit earlier, and they would understand how to be able to bypass security measures because they are inside the organization. So insider threats are personnel who are authorized access, right? And have information about the company. They might have access to resources, department information, facility, like physical building, storage, areas of the facility, and then equipment, networks, and systems. So some of the things that we can probably control, right? But a lot of the things we are going to rely on, like people awareness, reporting, and also how we train the individuals and then be able to do background check before we hire them. So let's go through and answer some of the questions while we're looking at the notes. So for number 1, it asks you, what are insider threats? How and why do these threats impact organizations? So we know that insider threats are employees. They could also be contractors. So you do see a lot of organizations that would hire contractors. These are professionals that support the organization, but they are not necessarily permanent employee. They might be contracted through another organization. So an example would be the Department of Defense, right? Instead of hiring employees, they would contract with Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and other organizations to provide contractors that work on specific projects for them, okay? And so that means that they have authorized access. You can find this on the page 1 of the notes. And with that, they might be able to cause damage or do harm to the department's mission, resources, other employees, personnel, facilities, information, equipment, network, and systems. So because of the insider knowledge, this is more difficult to detect compared to if we have an external threat, which is like an attacker, right? So insider threats, how it impact the organization, how they impact the organization would be that they can cause significant harm to the company because they have knowledge that outsider would not have, to the infrastructure where the sensitive data would be stored and how they can be accessed. And knowing that and having the access, it makes it easier for insider threats to exploit the vulnerability and bypass security measures. So it is imperative that we have thorough background check, especially for the people who access very sensitive, confidential data in the organization. We also need to monitor their activities and behavior. And it is a lot more difficult because there is a gray area when we question what would be considered privacy to the individual that works for the company. And then when it gets into the area of intellectual property and intellectual property rights, right? If they work for the organization and they get paid to build, to create, to be innovative, right? How does that leverage into individual intellectual property and organization intellectual property? Because let's say that you have an employee that created a design, right, while they're with the organization, and they have access to that design and they leak that design to a competitive company. By regulation, right, in a legal aspect, what that company can do is they can claim that design because while they're with that company, they work on that design during regular paid hours, right? The company owns that particular design. Now, in some cases, you have remote workers, and when we work remotely, sometimes we work on things in various hours. Sometimes it could be inside our working hours. Sometimes it's extra to our working hours because we're salaried, right? So arguably, you do see that, anytime that and then you also sign certain agreements when you work on certain projects. When you cannot disclose that information to other people, right? So your NDA is effective. And also you have agreements on the project where it is sensitive and that cannot be leaked, right? So in the case, if they leak the data, it becomes the company's liability, but yet at the same time, the company can take legal actions against that individual. Any question? So the human factor, as we talked a little bit about the social engineering aspect in phishing last week, right? This start to get into the human area, and it is a lot more difficult to manage. Computer systems, we can control a lot of that, right? It's pretty clear, it's black and white. Either you configure, you don't configure, either it has vulnerability or it doesn't. In the areas of human, people change. Sometimes you have good people that become disgruntled because maybe something they're unhappy or something is not met. And then sometimes people can be bought. That means that they can be paid with a large amount of money for that, to share some kind of information or data that will be critical to the competitive companies. So with that, we have to really look at separation of duties. We want to make sure we have check and balance. We want to audit. Okay. So before we head to number 2, right? Let's look at the motives a little bit. For most part, I think money is a big drive in security as an industry. You see this in attacks. You see this in insider threats, right? Because financial gain, let's say that someone gets offered millions of dollars to sell some kind of, creation or products that they had worked on. I remember FBI was mentioning about Boeing design, right? So Boeing designed a lot of different jets, and as soon as the design came out, a similar design was released in China for the same type of plane, but with better features. So they were able to track that there were some engineers that were leaking the design. And so in that sense, sometimes if it jeopardizes the nation, then it becomes a federal type of investigation. Then the company have to report to the FBI, and then they would be able to track who actually shared this information with, another nation or the competitor. Okay, so it could also be temperament, anger, grudges, right? Disgruntled activities. And then there's that area where people unknowingly make the mistakes. And then when they realize it, it's already late. For example, including when when you type in your email, sometimes you want to include people when you copy the email. And sometimes there is a mistype and other people get included in the email. Then we have a data leak. Wrong attachment is sent in email, and that had happened before, like P&B employees sent out sensitive information about the people, right? Accidentally through an Excel spreadsheet. And then from an IT or security perspective, we have to really track like where does that data go, right? Because data can be exchanged and be sold. And then we have to map out on how we should be able to contain the data. In the case if it is destroyed, then we have to see how we can rebuild the data and the cost behind that. So you see some motives information here. And then you have the unintentional threats. So it falls into some areas, as we said, that, you know, people make mistakes and it's normal, right? We would expect that there's some kind of error. And in the case of unintentional threats, you would see that there's negligence. And that means that they just expose data or sensitive information because of carelessness. Okay. And then there's accidental, where it is caused by just mistakes. And so, and in my opinion, these two areas, it's about training and it's about administration and management, right? So on the business side and on the operational side, there can be some form of control and, you know, management processes that would prevent this from happening. But as far as the email goes, we can filter by content. We can also block attachment that have sensitive information, so we can configure that. So there are a lot of things that cybersecurity professional can do to make sure that these things doesn't get, right, it doesn't exit outside of or leave the company, the type of information that we want to protect. Okay. All right, so let's go through and answer number 2. So for 2, let me move it up. So if you're still recording number 1. So for 2, we can say that in describe the types of unintentional insider threats in the organization, provide example on how these threats exist in the organizations. We can say that negligent insider threats, these are individuals who expose sensitive information to threat through carelessness. So maybe they're clicking the link without thinking twice about what kind of link they're clicking. And sometimes that could also be lack of knowledge and skill. So these individual, in the case that if we know who did that, right, these people needs to be trained. Okay. So in general, they are familiar with the infrastructure, the rules that are applied, but choose to ignore them. So they are negligent. And that will impose a risk for the organization. So in this case, it comes back, right? They are violating the policy because of negligence. So there gotta be a corrective action that takes place. They must go through training and appropriate assessment again for performance. So an example of this would be that the employee leaves the workstation unlocked, even though they know that they're supposed to log off, right? During lunch hours or when they're away from their desk. Even though we can configure the lock screen to turn on, right, after maybe 5 minutes. And when you leave the workstation unlocked, this allows other people to access sensitive data. It could be flashy, could be file that's used by the employee themselves, right? Or container, right? Folders, drives, network drives that these individuals have access to that will contain sensitive data. And some organizations are more strict than others. You would see that some organizations would be automatically dismissal in the case of negligence, right? And if they find the cause in this, and if it's negligent, so with that, we would have to do research, right? So you, as a security professional, you have to go back and see what had happened, right? Let's say that if they don't log off the computer, we have to also check surveillance, if they have surveillance system. And then you also look at like the activity. So with that, if the companies want to build the case and look into this matter, then we would have to see what had happened on that system at specific time. Then you have the accidental insider threats. And this is not intentional. So it's caused by mistake. So let's say that you have employees that have access to external drives or storage, right? SD, USB, and it might contain corporate information or data, which cause data leak. And people lose laptop all the time, right? So with laptop and mobile devices, we can do remote lock. That's definitely achievable. As soon as it's reported, we can, or if there's failed login attempt, we can lock the device. So you can obtain the service or the software to do that. But if it's not reported, then you have that gap of time in between, right? If it falls into the wrong hand, then it can cause a lot of problems. Then we have to find out like how much data is leaked. So if they lose a USB drive, and that USB drive they use to work on their project, and so we know that that USB drive contains specific data, so we have to investigate as well. So there are things that we can also control with data storage like this. External drive, right? We can encrypt the USB so that way, in the case they lose it, other people cannot have access to sensitive data. So that's another solution that we can implement. Okay. We can also do away with USB drives in general. That's what I normally try to encourage corporations to do, because it's an extra area of an extra risk that you have to address. And then USB drive would also introduce things to your networking systems that you don't want. And then, like I said before, if they unintentionally attach something in email, we can control some of that with email content filter, right? We can also set email encryption for sensitive data to be routed, and so that way, even if somebody is copied on the email, and if they don't have access or the key to decrypt the data, they will not be able to read the sensitive data. So it's just, we have to think about like what if, right? There's expectation that there will be mistakes. And so we got to make sure that we have the countermeasure to address that type of expectation. That's important. Any question regarding unintentional insider threats? So let's go through number 3, and we're gonna dive a little deeper, and we're gonna look at the category of insider threats. Right? So number 3, it says describe intentional threats and provide an example of how these threats impact the organization. So we talked about unintentional threats. Those are people who are either negligent or, they mistakenly do something that can cause harm, right? The intentional threat, these are the people who take actions to harm the organization for personal benefits, or to act on personal grievance. For example, someone did not get a raise, right? This person becomes disgruntled, and let's say that they would try to delete data. But if you have backup to your data, you should be able to recover the data. With just that we have lost time, right? to be able to pull the data that was previously backed up. If the data is not backed up, then we have to rebuild the data. So that's cost and lost time. So an example of this would be an employee steals data to advance his, her, or their career. And that's very, very, very common, right? 80% of employees that leave the organization use prior company's data to leverage their new job. They can also be paid by, entity or nation state to leak some form of data. You see this with clearance and secret clearance type of positions as well. That's why there's like and there's a strong emphasis on high clearance and, secret clearance and so on. And the investment that goes behind clearance, on average, if you go through clearance for a position like working for NSA, DOD, military bases, you often see that on average, company spends about $10,000 to hire that individual with clearance. Did you know that? The amount of money. So to send an investigator out to interview people, to clear people, right? It starts from $2,000 and up. We looked into this, right, for our apprenticeship program because we did think about like contracting with companies that require clearance. And it's just the cost is not effective, right? Most companies, they're like, oh, we'll hire the candidates if they pass clearance, but the clearance itself costs about $7,000 to $10,000 basically. And then in the case, because it's multiple layers, you talk to what neighbors, friends, all the people you list. So I think you have to list like 7 to 12 people that you know, right? If you've gone, and I have gone through clearance for people where people will come and talk to me about so-and-so that took my class or had worked with me. And so the time and the documentation that goes into that for the report for the clearance is a lot of money. And then they looked into, in some cases, they also follow people, right? When you go to the gym, so they wanted to see your normal activity in the day, what it would look like, okay? So in some jobs, you are required to never disclose the information at that job. And in that case, a lot of times, there's extra level in investigation. Okay, question? All right. So you can find information on intentional threats on page 2 of your notes. Okay. And then there's expanded example. So let's talk about other insider threats. You got the collusive threats. This is the subset of the malicious insider threats. So likely that they would collaborate in groups. And sometimes it would start with one individual and then they would try to expand by bringing in people, right? Like, let's say that I started not liking the company because, maybe I'm losing my benefits or whatever it is. Then I would talk to my coworkers to get you to agree on my beliefs and then to carry out some kind of action. So in that case, you have collusive threats. And then you have the third party threats. These could be partners or contractors, people that are affiliated with your organization, like vendors. And so they would be able to access some resources or systems like database, inventory databases, in the case if they're suppliers, or networks, right? So if you have contractors that periodically comes and audit your systems, or work on your system, so they would have access to your system and networks. And so they fall into a direct or indirect threat because sometimes that they are directly impacting the organization and sometimes they would indirectly impacting the organization, through their own networks and their devices, okay? So we really have to think about that in the case of if you have enterprises that are very large, that they outsource a lot of things. So when they start outsourcing, you have to really look at this category quite a bit. So as a pen tester, right, you have to also have that lens. We talked a lot about using technical tool to assess system, but you also have to assess people and physical space, right? As a pen tester or an ethical hacker, that's important. Okay, so let's do number 4. Identify the types of insider threats based on the given scenario. A staff member who collaborates with a branch manager to steal data from the organization for financial gains. That's intentional and collusive insider threats, right? They plan on it, so there's intention. And because they collaborate, right, one with the next, the employee and the manager, that is a collusive insider threat. B, an employee who mistyped email addresses and sent sensitive information to external recipients. This is unintentional insider threat, right? They made a mistake. C, a contractor who uses his access to obtain companies' proprietary designs for career advantages. That's intentional and third-party threat. Now you also have, like, if you watch Snowden the movie, right? Is he an insider threat? He's a whistleblower. So how did he get all of that data to me, right? In the Rubik Cube, if you haven't seen the movie. Because when he checked into the DoD center, I think that was Hawaii, I forgot which location. You cannot carry any electronics, so no smartphone, right? No USB, because they don't want you to bring out data from their center. So he was able to extract the data and put it on the USB, and how he snuck that data out was he was playing with the Rubik Cube. He stuck the USB into the Rubik Cube. When he goes through the scanner, he pops the Rubik Cube to the security people who check, right, for metal devices or electronic devices. So the security agent took the Rubik Cube and walked it across, so that's how he bypassed the data leak, because he would not be able to leak that through email, they'll find it, right? And so on. So in that movie, you can see a lot of the activity that falls into this area as insider threat. Now he's leveraging the data, right? Because that's his point of negotiation. Otherwise, there's question about whether he's going to be able to live. Because technically, when at the point of arrest, he was like meters, right, from agents that came to arrest him, but because he is in a different nation, they're not able to do that. Now he wants to come back, so there have been talk about, like, how he can negotiate to come back and he's in. So, questions, comments? Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's called Snowy.
Yeah. So, but I was thinking that I don't think that all the data that he obtained is fully disclosed, right? That's the key, because if he disclosed all the data, then there's no value, right, in him. So there's some stuff that went to the media, but so that's questionable. So in that case, you see that he is an insider threat. And then for D, it fell onto the next page. A managers of company's partner works with a group of employees who steal equipment from the shipping warehouse and sell the equipment online for financial gain. So you can see that it is a partner, right? And they also work with internal employees, so it is collusive, and it is third party because, there is a partnership, and then it is intentional. So fraudulent cases falls into a lot of different areas. I'm trying to see where we can keep this so some of you are still recording, right? You see cases like this where you have theft within, and activities like this can go on for a long time, right? I think a couple of years ago, there was a Best Buy warehouse situation. Internal employee, they worked with like a group of logistic group that they were able to steal from Best Buy by rerouting the truck to supply the Best Buy warehouses where they ship the equipment to the store or to the customer. And then eventually they cracked that down. It wasn't too far from here. I think it's in the Ontario area. And they were talking about like they found, so it was going on for like 6 months and they accumulated so much equipment and sold a lot, and it was over a certain amount of money. I forgot, but you do see activities like that. So the question is, are we doing a good job in background checking these people, especially even on the third party end, right? What kind of credibility that we have with the organization that we have partnership with, to have that happening, right? And also because if you have quality in the type of delivery for services, then the question is, why are these activities happening, right? There gotta be a cause. So in that case, from an IT and security perspective, can we do a better job tracking inventory, databases, access, and surveillance devices to make sure that this is not happening? Okay. Okay. And then you have cases that would have organizational violence. And you tend to see this more in the media for academia, right? Like school violence, like school shootings, stuff like that. But it's common in corporates and enterprise. Sometimes it doesn't hit the media because of public relations. So some example that you would see for organizational violence would be one, an employee threatens another employee based on disagreement of business practices or political beliefs. That's very common, right? So sometimes there's disagreement and they would physically fight, right? New employees are bullied or harassed by the manager or other employees. That's common, very, very common in corporate enterprise, nonprofit, and public sector. So you don't have a lot of support in diversity and equitable workplace possibly because of management strategies. There gotta be something that would help monitor these things better, right? Favoritism is not allowed, right? So how can we detect those kind of activities? Those form of harassment. Supervisor sexually harass staff member in promise of promotions and career advantages. So nowadays, right, thanks to the digital technology that we have in communication and network, things are traceable. Messages, email, especially these areas, right? A lot of time, bullying, or doesn't have to be cyberbullying. There's gotta be some form of communication. If it's verbal, video surveillance tracking. If you don't have that kind of footage, sometimes that's communicated in email, right? Text messages and things like that. So this is when your forensic skills come in. Sometimes you have to pull the SIM, because if they're provided with companies' devices like smartphones, which a lot of managers have, right? Companies have the right to investigate those smartphones. Now, when you have to bring your own devices to work, that's questionable, but you have to make sure that they sign an agreement at the beginning that their devices is subject to, right, monitoring and forensic processes in the case if there's incident. So there has to be some kind of policy that will put that in place. And then the four things, manager sends messages that contain sexual images to his team members. I actually investigated a case like this, right? There was accusation for sexual harassment that someone jokingly put a message in the email to a recipient. And then I have to go in and look if that had happened because the email was deleted, right? And at the time there was like no screenshot was used because technology was not that advanced back then, or people don't know how to use it like that. But we were able to find the attachment because thanks to mine, right? Email headers tells us everything. And when we're able to find the image file and then going back and pull the network traffic for that, right? Because your packets tells you everything that happened. And so I was able to find, so it was an image that, that is explicit. It's nothing crazy, but it's, how sometimes people send you a picture of an object that represents another object. It was that, right? But people perceive it the wrong way or differently. So one would think it's funny, the other one thinks it's not, so it becomes an issue. And so, so I was asked to be able to look into that, and so it took me like less than a day to find it, but you would need to find information like that on email, chat messages, and so on. And then former employee threatens to burn the company's building, and so that's like a threat, okay? So that it falls into the organizational violence. People would get mad and says, I burned down this company, right? And so, and if that's on record, it's gonna be recorded in their file. Question. Okay, so where can you find all of these information? So in the next section, it talks about threat occurrences, okay, violence, espionage, sabotage, theft, and cyber acts. These are the manifests of threats. And then there's the violence category. So threatening behavior, hostile, abusive, intimidating, right? You see that with bullying, sexual harassment or other form of harassment, threats, physical threats, and then workplace and organizational violence. I'm sure that many of you, when you start working, they make you go through trainings and it talks about all of this. But in this class, I want you to think about, if I'm asked to find information like this, how do I approach it? Right? You have to understand what it is in order to investigate it. And in cybersecurity, we find traces of it across the system. Information that's shared in digital formats, right? So, and then you want to be able to detect this or prevent this from happening. Okay, so espionage, this is illicit practice on spying, right? And often you would see this with one nation to the next. It could be nation state sponsored, okay? And so there would be a lot of different industry that falls into this area. Financial industry, scientific research, technical area, engineering. There's a lot of things that falls into this category because there's competitiveness in advancing a country or advancing products of that country or technology of that country. So you see economic espionage, that's very common. And then you have government espionage. This is intelligence gathering. And it is usually for military warfare advantages. You hear some of this in the news about, cyber warfare and what we're doing between North Korea, America, China, and other nations, right? And we think about utility in the grid and how that supports the nation as a whole. Or in some cases, it is really who's reaching certain technology, or in the case of COVID-19, right? Vaccination was something that everybody was looking at. Medication was something everybody was looking at. And so that becomes like a critical, sensitive data. Those type of research is important for one nation to thrive compared to the next. It's about survival, so survival in a sense. But from that aspect, we have to take a look at, how a corporate is functioning with all of these potential issues, and then you gotta think about like how the nation is, how its operation that would be in the case that you have espionage or economic government espionage. And then you have criminal espionage. This would involve citizens, US citizens, betraying the government to the foreign nation. So do you think Robert Snowden fall into this area? Right, there's two sides to this, right? The aspect of, some people believe that he did what he had to do, because without having that acknowledged, we would not fully known. We know, but we confirm, right? And then so in other cases, when you look at the other side of the coin, he violated policy, right? He betrayed, right? So in some sense, you do see that like there's two sides to the story in that. And then there's sabotage, physical, virtual. So physical sabotage is when you aim to harm infrastructure, systems, equipment, right? And then you have virtual sabotage. There would be technical means to disrupt or stop organization business, like denial of service attack, or disrupt network connectivity. Okay, so let's go through and look at the next few questions. Okay, so let's take a look at 6. Given the below scenarios, identify the types of espionage and how they occur in organization or nations. A, an engineer infiltrates an aerospace company to steal plane designs for another company in a different country. That's economic and government espionage, right? And these could be military planes. It doesn't have to be your plane to transport people in general, or it could be that, right? Design planes, planes can be important because it carries cargo and people, and then you got fighter jets that are used for warfare purposes. So that will be economic and government espionage. This is actually a case that happened, right? And then a senior developer was paid by China government to leak US utility infrastructure software code. And that's government and criminal espionage. And then US researcher leaked US government weapon design to Russia, and that's government and criminal espionage. And then lastly, an executive was paid to leak client data to competing companies. That's economic espionage. So at Cal State San Bernardino, they have a cybersecurity program that's called National Security, right? It really addressed the plan in how we can effectively protect the nation through cybersecurity concepts. I think a lot of the cybersecurity concepts are essential in how we look at, our nation's, resources, and things like that. And so therefore you see there's shortage in that area, and there's emphasis in, government agencies hiring individuals that have knowledge in this area. So if you look into that, you can think about, potential job in with agencies like Department of Defense, NSA, FBI, CIA, and so on. Now, can you get that type of job with just getting a cybersecurity degree certificate? Sure, right? It doesn't mean that you have to have the credential in that. You can have the knowledge and the skill sets that's required for, you know, a lot of the jobs at the agency. You can still obtain a job if you clear, right? We have to pass clearance. Okay, next we're going to talk about financial crimes. So for 7, it says provide example of financial crimes and intellectual property theft that can be committed by an insider. So these are the objective for a lot of the insider threats, right? Because they want to gain. And, you know, we talked about monetary gains is an area that's really is a motive. So financial crime, a manager steals product shipments from a shipping warehouse. That's a financial crime. Another financial crime, account payable staff member sends himself payments. There was a recent case, I think I saw it over a few days ago, right? A bank employee was charged where she has funneled some of she had extracted like cents from different accounts and then funneled that fund into her own. She was able to buy like many properties, gifted family members, a lot of different things. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to make her pay back for all of these that she stole. And the sad part was some of the accounts that she was taken from were retirees account, senior accounts. Those people had worked all their life to save up so that way they can retire. And so there was charges and things that was processed, or sometime when people complain about it, she'll debit the account back. So she'll put the money back. And it would be like $4, $3 here and there. And they mentioned that it was like over thousands of accounts. So, and over so many years that the companies were not able to track that. And banking companies, financial company, they're really good at tracking fraudulent like that. But because she's an insider threat and she was, you know, she carefully crafted her plans of actions on how she would transfer this type of money, it was harder to track. And then you have the intellectual property theft. Pharmaceutical researcher sells new drug formulas to the competitive company, right? And then the next one, intellectual property theft. An engineer, contractor steals machinery designs to leverage his new job negotiation. And you see a lot of this in the technical world as well. Engineers that, you know, get fired or lay off, they would take whatever that they have worked on the design, and then they would go and apply to the next company because they had worked on that design. They have some insight on that design, and so therefore they are able to do that, right? And if you're familiar with Oculus, right? Facebook Meta owns Oculus, but before Oculus became Meta product, right? The director for Oculus negotiated with Facebook, now known as Meta, for lots of money to be able to say that, you know, I will give you the design if you buy my company and give me a position in it, right? And so that's what happened. Facebook did. And so now Facebook owns that product. And so did all his team go with him when the merge happened? Not necessarily. Some of the engineer actually went and worked applied for job at other organizations. And then whether they took the design with them or not, but from what I recall, Oculus full design was sold to Facebook. And after that, because Facebook was gonna get caught by that actual negotiation, so they acquired the company to avoid any kind of, repercussion in legal aspects. So did they really want to buy the company? Not necessarily. They just didn't want to get caught in that fraudulent situation, so they acquired the company. Okay, question? Okay. Um, so intellectual property theft and financial crime, you can find it on page 3. And then it talks about cyber threat, like theft, espionage, violence, all of the things that we talked about in earlier, right? That can be included in the category for cyber. And it also have intentional and unintentional. Okay, so let's answer number 8. Identify the type of cyber insider threats based on the below scenarios. A, employee clicks on the link of advertisement pop-up ad, which caused the malware to be downloaded on the system. And it is unintentional cyber insider threat. This happens to a lot of people, a lot of the organization that have ransomware impacted. It is unintentional cyber insider threat issue, right? So what we can do better in this scenario is that we want to make sure that they are aware of the type of malicious links or servers or malware that they can introduce to the organization if they click the inappropriate link, the malicious link. So user awareness and training is important. Now, in the case that we are responding to this incident, many of you will be falling into that category, right? They click on it, right? And then they downloaded something on the system, right? We should respond how? Disconnect the system right away, right? Look at where that malware is coming from, doing a network capture on that. Run anti-malware or security software on that system to contain or quarantine that malware. And then once you do that, you would then investigate, because you would see like what kind of malware it is, how is it going to be impacted, you know. So if you instantly disconnect, likely the spread is contained. So we have to physically disconnect the cable or quarantine that system, right? And then because it's surfaced on your network and downloaded through your network, you need to take a look at your network activity and also to see if there a potential spread across the network, because after they click that link, that segment of the network might have some risk. Okay. Okay, scenario B. A manager removes group permissions from various folders and deletes important files from the network drives before leaving the company. This is intentional cyber insider threats in general, right? They're unhappy with the company. So this is why, right, we disable the account immediately up on, resignation. Do not wait until the end of the workday, right? If 8 a.m., if they turn in the resignation, 8:01, you need to disable the account right away, okay? Because things like this will happen. We don't want to delete the account. We disable that user account. Why? Because, we don't want them to collect the data for intellectual property reasons. Or delete things. Okay. A staff member unknowingly clicks a phishing link on an email message, which requests her to reset login credential. This is unintentional cyber insider threat. It could also be negligence if they had training. If they haven't had training, that it is just unintentional, right? And so with that, how do you fix this problem? You make her go to the training after the fact, but as soon as this is reported, you reset her account right away, right? So, and then you go back and look at the logs to make sure that nobody else is logging into her account. So, you know, when that gets reported, we gotta make sure that we looked at success and failed login attempts for this particular. So event viewers here or logged, right, log system, and be able to track that. A contractor plugs the personal USB drive containing keylogger to capture all user input on the system, right? Intentional cyber insider threat. So to remove this problem from the start, disable the USB connection in the front of the system or in general, right? And then if they need to use a USB drive, they need to go through and request that option, right? And it's approval upon review. So we want to make sure, and even if we allow USB drive, make sure that we require the scan. It has to scan in order to open. You can write a script for that. You can set your security software to do that. It is definitely achievable. A lot of people said that, you know, I have to use USB in my company. I can't do anything. Yes, you can. There are tons of things that you can do, right? Educate the user. A lot of times, you know, the human part, if they are armed with more knowledge, right, they're able to make an appropriate decision. Okay, let me move 8 down so we can see the next question. Okay, kind of long, but like I said before, we don't have to put it verbatim, right? I want to give you the information, but if you like to, you can record it that way. You can also summarize it. Number 9, how can insider threats be detected and prevented in organizations? So what is all this about, right? We want to learn how it's done, how we can detect it, and how we can prevent it, and that's our job. So we want to implement technical control. One key area, access control, is important. Least privilege, right? Requirements for access. So do not give them more than they should. Looking at role-based access control. Implement policy for those roles. So access control is critical. Using encryption for your sensitive data, right? And if you have data that is in motion, think about email encryption, web encryption, data in use. You can think about file encryption, storage encryption, or even when data is data that's stored, you can think about how that's stored, who has access to that source. So permission control and encryption for those. And then we should do a better job in monitor the activities, the systems, access, accounts, any kind of unusual, suspicious activity. Your security management system, you can set it to sound off alarm for anomalies, right? Your SIEM. You can also have authentication system audit, right? And we want to do that more regularly so we can detect like unauthorized access or escalation of privileges, things like that. In the next section of your notes, after it discussed the intellectual theft, intellectual property theft, and financial crime, you would see a thing called user behavior analytics, or UBA. Now integrated with generative AI, which is awesome, right? You can identify the pattern for anomalies in user activities. So it's building the data based on historical use. For example, I have an employee that comes to work, right? Does his thing, access Excel spreadsheet, add data, store it, And then occasionally he goes on a website, look at baseball scores or whatever it is. It tracks all of that, application use, access, all of those things, and it builds up the data. And then one day he clicks on the link and downloaded the malicious malware, right? So that anomaly is then tracked because it is an outlier based on his regular activity. So if you monitor that and you feed the data for the system, it's going to tell you, right, what is the normal behavior for all your users. And then the outlier of those behaviors is gonna then notify, right, the notify you so that way you can track what's going on. We can go in and look at the logs, we can stop it happening as it is. So it looks at patterns and anomalies for user actions to indicate any potential insider threat. And so the question is there privacy? Not necessarily when you're on company's hours, right? Now, if you want privacy, then use your own system. I think, you know, and maybe your own network and your own resources, because everybody that's on the network is subject to screening, right? I told the story in my last class, right? I had one of my position a long time ago was to gather the data for user internet activities. You know, so the application, you know, it lets you use the browser, the internet, so it pulls the history, it pulls the cookies. It does the analysis at the end of the day, or throughout the day. I have to take a look at the data. I have to see any kind of you know, inappropriate activity. And at the time I was an administrator for a school. So one day, as I was pulling the data, and it was in the afternoon, I found a staff looking at child pornography, right? Immediately report disabled his account, and then I have to write up the report. And it turns out that, you know, he had his curtains closed and all of these things happening to kind of, you know, he said that he was taking a break, right? And so definitely an inappropriate action. Then we have to also report it to law enforcement. So, you know, so you see this all the time, right? A lot of times companies allow the user to have more freedom and access on internet, but just keep in mind that everything that goes through the network is, you know, can be monitored and can be evaluated. All right. And we want to make sure that we have regular training and security awareness training and education program to help employees recognize and report any suspicious behavior or incident, right? And we want to have a good reporting system where people don't feel, they don't feel bad when they're reporting incidents. A lot of times people don't say anything because they don't want to cause any problem, right? Because then they're gonna get questions, they have to, you know, it's kind of like you witness an accident and then you're gonna have to wait and report to the police and all of these things. So some people, they don't want that extra time, right? That extra work. So we want to make it where it is easy to report, it is effective to report, there's response right away, and people don't feel intimidated when they file the report. And so that becomes an effective reporting system. And then you would implement data loss prevention solutions, making sure that we track our data, right? Identify and prevent unauthorized access or transfer of your sensitive information. That's, you know, a lot of work can go into DLP. DLP is such a big area that, you know, because people are like, oh, I'll just use encryption for my DLP. That's just one thing, right? You have a lot of things like permission control. You have to look at like the type of data that is being accessed and by whom, right? Mapping out that data to the accounts that access it. And then looking at how your permissions are affected. All right, and then promoting whistleblower policy to encourage employees to come forward with any concern. We talked a little bit about that with the reporting system. like, it could be anonymously reported. They don't need to, so. But then you gotta be careful about anonymously report, right? People might use that as an advantage to, take revenge on somebody or, so. We have to investigate both sides, bless you. Okay, so the common results. What is the outcome or the output of all of this? The common result for insider threats, companies or organization would face financial loss or individual, sometimes that could be individual, loss of privacy, intellectual property theft, IP stands for intellectual property theft, unauthorized disclosure. Because, once it goes public, you can't, now everything is disclosed, right? Then you have disruption of IT services or network systems. You might have damages to the infrastructure. So when we say infrastructure, that encompasses all your servers, your equipment, your system, your communication system, everything combined, right? And then IT services that could pertain to web applications and so on. So services fall under infrastructure. But infrastructure could also relate to cloud and cloud companies. So when we're looking at like virtual insider threats, right, that can cause cyber damages to our system via network connections, and it impacts the cloud. So it could be very from case to case. And then when you have violence or, other things that would be in severity, we might have physical injury or even death. Any question? So this area is not about technical, but is pertaining to technicality of our function, right? Because we might be asked to investigate or look into certain matters. We also want to make sure that we detect or prevent this from happening. Okay. Then I'll start 11. Check the time. Go pretty good on time. All right. Determine the following statements about successful insider threat mitigation approaches. Is it true or false, right? So we want to have tactics or strategies on how we would address insider threats. And in the next section of your notes, it talks about how you can do that to mitigate insider threats. So our goal is to ultimately mitigate. So mitigate doesn't mean that we completely remove, like we can't just get rid of all of them, right? They might be critical people to our operation. So we want to make sure that we approach it in a way where it is feasible. We want to align the insider threat mitigation program principles and standards with the culture and the business of an organization. So that's important. That's true. Okay. Emphasizing culture and the business of the organization. So looking at their mission, right? Looking at the activities and the culture, the population and how people interact. So we want to make sure that we have the program that really cater or customize for that company's mission, operations and their people. And then B, prioritize critical assets, both physical and intellectual, that are essential to operation or business of the organization and whose compromise, damage, loss can have an adverse impact to its mission. True. So we want to look at critical assets, people, right? Could be building, facility, physical. right? And then intellectual designs, concepts, arts, things that people build and create, right? And how that would be related to operation and business. It could be products or services for that business. And so if those critical assets are not addressed, then we would have downfall in adverse impact. So true for B. Then C, centralize information for collection, integration, analysis, storage for all elements pertaining to insider threats. Yes, that's true. So what does this mean? We want to make sure that when we have information about insider threat, we collect it, right? The data about behavior, activities, etc. And then we want to integrate and analyze it. And we want to make sure that we share this, right, for the decision makers. It will become a report. So that way people have access to it and so they can have knowledge of who are the insider threats and how we can improve from that. So centralize the information for collection and integration analysis is important. And then D, build business management team for assessment, response, and management potential insider threats. False. It's threat management team. So in the threat management team, it would entail decision makers and business people, but the majority of the time you're gonna see that the technical people, like cybersecurity professionals and IT professionals, will fall into this category as well. Because when you look at cyber threat, that's our realm, right? Our area. This should be N. I have a typo here. And then E, create an incident response plan to address potential insider threat incidents. True. So I read a lot of IRP in the upper division classes and master programs, right? You see incident response plan. A lot of them really address like infrastructure, technical systems, whatnot. But you also need an area for insider threats. In the case of incidents, we talked about financial crime, right? Like how do you respond to that? Like what I said earlier. What if it's unintentional? What if someone clicks the link? What if they downloaded something? What if, right? The expectation is there. So you need to make sure that this is in your IRP. So when you hit Cal State San Bernardino and they make you write an IRP, or when you take CIS27B, make sure, right, your IRP, incident response plan, not only address the technical things like attacks and stuff like that, but it also include insider threats incidents, like what we talked about from the beginning. Okay, I'm gonna move 11 down. Let me see. Oh, that's it, right? Short assignments. Any question regarding the content we covered today? Okay, let me stop recording.